The world watched in silence. But in the heart of West Africa, a storm was brewing. It was not a storm of chaos. It was a storm of awakening. Burkina Faso, a small nation with a giant heart, had finally said a word that shook the entire world. No. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who dared to challenge decades of Western dominance. The man who made a continent believe again. That day, the day Traoré said no, Africa finally woke up. They called it madness. They said it was political suicide. But for Traoré, it was destiny. He had watched his people toil in mines, while their gold filled foreign banks. He had seen farmers work endless fields, yet import food they could grow themselves. He had seen leaders bow, smile, and sign deals that bled Africa dry. And he had had enough. When a Western delegation arrived in Ouagadougou, with smiles, briefcases, and promises, they thought they'd meet another puppet. Instead, they met a lion. "My people will not starve while you fill your pockets," Traoré said, his voice cutting through the marble room like thunder. He refused billions in so-called aid. He rejected military deals dressed as partnerships. He tore apart contracts that made Burkina Faso dependent. For the first time in modern history, a leader stood up and said, "Africa will rise, not with your permission, but with our own power." News spread like wildfire. Across Africa, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, young men and women cheered. Social media exploded. Traoré said no became a rallying cry. In Mali, in Niger, and Guinea, soldiers saluted his courage. In Ghana and Senegal, students quoted his words in the streets. Even in distant cities, Paris, Washington, and London, analysts whispered, "What if Africa really unites?" Because deep down they knew this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. This was about a chain reaction that could change the balance of the entire world. In the capital city, a new sun was rising, both literally and symbolically. The Burkinabe flag waved higher than ever before. The air was filled with hope and fire. Young engineers began working on local energy projects. Women started new cooperatives, selling shea butter, honey, and fabrics made in Burkina Faso. Soldiers rebuilt schools in areas once forgotten. And on the walls of the city, one phrase was written over and over again: sovereignty or death. But for every revolution, there's resistance. Western media began their campaign. Traoré is turning authoritarian, they said. He's isolating his people, they wrote. They called sanctions. They froze accounts. They threatened aid suspension. But it didn't matter. The fire had already spread. Traoré went on national television, calm, composed, yet unshakable. He looked straight into the camera and said, "Brothers and sisters, they will call us rebels, they will call us radical, but the real radicals are those who have stolen from us for centuries." And that one speech, that one moment became history. It was replayed millions of times. Every child in Africa who watched it whispered the same thing under their breath: "We can be free too." Behind the scenes, Western diplomats scrambled. They offered new deals. They tried to divide the alliance. They even pushed propaganda through neutral news channels. But this time, Africa wasn't listening. The new generation had phones, internet, and voices. They saw the lies. They shared the truth. Traoré's vision had become a movement. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a poor landlocked nation, had become the heart of a revolution. And for the first time in decades, Africa was not begging, it was building. And that's when the moment of truth arrived. The U.S. envoy sent a private message. A proposal worth $500 million on one condition: allow American military bases on Burkinabe soil. But Traoré's answer was the same as always: no. When the document was presented, he stood up, folded it, and said quietly, "Burkina Faso is not for sale." The room went silent. No one had ever done that before. Not like this, not with such clarity. Outside the presidential palace, thousands gathered chanting his name. They weren't cheering a politician. They were celebrating freedom. And while Western analysts tried to calculate what had gone wrong, they missed the simplest truth. Africa had remembered who she was. The land of gold, the cradle of civilization, the mother of all nations. And this awakening, this roaring defiance, had one face, one voice, one name: Ibrahim Traoré. But the story didn't end there. What happened next would shake the global system itself. When the powers that once ruled Africa realized they were losing control, the world stage was trembling. After Traoré's historic no, Western capitals fell into quiet panic. For decades, they'd pulled the strings: political, financial, and military. Now, a young captain from a small West African country had cut every single one of them. Meetings in Paris ran past midnight. Washington's think tanks wrote report after report. The words Burkina Faso were suddenly everywhere in headlines, on news tickers, in intelligence briefings. They couldn't believe it. A 36-year-old soldier had just broken the system. Traore didn't stop there. He called upon neighboring nations, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and formed what the world would soon know as the Alliance of Sahel Nations. The message was clear: if we stand alone, we fall. But if we unite, we rise. For the first time since the fall of great African empires like Mali and Songhai, West Africa was speaking with one voice. In Bamako, citizens marched with Burkinabe flags. In Niamey, soldiers saluted Traore's courage. Even across the continent, in Kenya, South Africa, and Ghana, people began saying, Africa is changing, because one man said no. But with change came consequences. The retaliation began. Foreign NGOs were expelled, accused of espionage. Media channels critical of the government were banned. International banks froze millions in aid and investment. Yet the streets of Ouagadougou were full of music. People didn't care about aid. They cared about dignity. Traore appeared again on national television, wearing his signature red beret. He looked straight into the camera, and his words became immortal. Brothers and sisters of Africa, they think our freedom has a price, but we say, our blood is not for sale. Our land is not for rent. Our soul is not for export. The nation erupted. It wasn't just a leader talking. It was an entire generation finally speaking. Across the Sahel, something extraordinary was happening. Roads once controlled by foreign troops were now guarded by local soldiers. Burkinabe engineers started repairing old power grids, abandoned by Western firms. Farmers, inspired by Traore's message, began new community-driven cooperatives. A new slogan was painted across schools and marketplaces: made by us for us. Children learned history that had been erased for years. Stories of African kings, scientists, warriors, and thinkers. The narrative was shifting, but the West was watching and planning. Leaked documents from European diplomatic circles revealed an unsettling truth. They were preparing economic retaliation, sanctions disguised as security measures. They wanted to crush the new African momentum before it grew stronger. Yet Traore had expected it all. He summoned his advisors late one evening and said, they will try to starve us into submission, but they forget hunger builds fighters, and fighters build nations. The plan that followed stunned the world. Burkina Faso announced a national resource sovereignty program, a move that transferred control of all mines, oil fields, and natural resources back to the people. Foreign corporations were ordered to renegotiate or leave. Gold exports were redirected to fund schools, hospitals, and military independence. For the first time, the Burkinabe army was building drones, not imported, but locally crafted. The government launched solar energy projects across the countryside, and the central bank started studying a new gold-backed currency to end dependency on the CFA franc. When asked about the decision, Traore said simply, if they own our money, they own our future. So we take back both. Western media called it economic suicide. African people called it rebirth. Everywhere there was pride and fear, because never before had an African nation pushed this far, this fast. The message was spreading, and so was unity. Soon, students across Africa began wearing t-shirts that read, Traore's Spirit, Africa First. Songs, poems, documentaries, all celebrated this new era of defiance. And through it all, the captain remained humble, refusing to call himself a hero. I am not fighting for power, he said. I am fighting so that my son's children won't need to fight again. But beneath the celebration, shadows were moving. Satellite images showed unidentified drones flying over Burkinabe airspace. Western intelligence agencies were suspected of funding dissidents within the borders, and whispers spread that an attempted coup might already be underway. The people stood alert. The army stayed loyal. And in the heart of Ouagadougou, Traore addressed his nation one more time. His voice echoed through the radios, the televisions, and the hearts of millions. Brothers and sisters, we are surrounded not by enemies, but by fear. Fear that we will fail. Fear that we will give up. But fear dies when courage stands up. And today, Africa stands tall. Outside, the crowd erupted into chants of Traore, Traore. People waved flags, burned old contracts, and held up signs saying, Burkina Faso is not for sale. Meanwhile, international analysts began admitting what few dared to say out loud. This young man might just reshape Africa forever. His vision had become too big to contain, too loud to silence, too real to deny. But this was only the beginning, because when Traore's movement grew beyond borders, the powers of the world decided to strike back. The morning after Traoré's fiery speech, the streets of Ouagadougou were painted with pride and tension. Children waved flags from rooftops. Soldiers marched through the markets, not as conquerors, but as protectors of something sacred, a dream reborn. For the first time in decades, the word freedom didn't sound like a fantasy. It was here, in the dust, in the air, in the hearts of the Burkinabe. But far beyond the borders of this new awakening, the echo of Traoré's defiance reached Washington, London, and Paris, and it terrified them. Inside the halls of Western power, they didn't call him President Traoré. They called him the disruptor, because what he had done in a single year, no African leader had dared in 50. He had exposed the illusion of control. He had shown the continent that their chains weren't made of steel, they were made of fear. And fear, once broken, can never be reforged. So meetings began, secret, quiet, and cold. Policy analysts spoke of stabilization. Spies spoke of containment. Economists whispered about targeted isolation. Their goal was clear: stop the Burkinabe revolution before it spreads. The attack didn't come with bombs. It came with pressure. Global banks froze Burkina Faso's assets. Aid organizations suddenly pulled out, claiming security concern. Media outlets launched coordinated stories, calling Traoré a dictator in disguise. But for every headline they wrote, Traoré answered with action. He opened new trade talks, not with the West, but with Russia, China, and neighboring African allies. He signed a defense pact with Mali and Niger to build a joint anti-terror force. And he declared that Burkina Faso would no longer attend Western-dominated summits. "We don't need invitations to sit at our own table," he said. That one sentence became the most replayed quote on African social media. It spread like wildfire, captioned with one line: "Africa doesn't need permission to be free." Even as the people celebrated, Traoré knew the storm was only getting darker. Foreign intelligence reports warned him of plots, not from enemies abroad, but from within. Corrupt officials, bribed with foreign money, were planning to undermine him. Late one night, inside the dimly lit military headquarters, Traoré gathered his closest allies. The room was silent, except for the sound of boots echoing on concrete floors. He placed both hands on the table and spoke in a low, steady voice. "My brothers, they will not invade us with tanks. They will buy our loyalty, one coin at a time. But if we sell it, we sell our children's future, and I will never allow that." His generals nodded, the room heavy with tension, filled with something unspoken: devotion. Weeks passed. The Western media began predicting Burkina Faso's collapse. But instead, the opposite happened. Factories reopened under local ownership. Women-led cooperatives began exporting handmade products under the label Burkina First. University students started a national innovation drive, building small-scale machines for farming, energy, and transport. Across Africa, something ancient and powerful was awakening: confidence. Leaders from smaller nations started echoing Traoré's speeches. Even the youth in cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg began saying, "If Burkina can do it, so can we." The revolution was no longer political. It was psychological. But when hope grows, the enemy grows desperate. One morning, international news broke. A failed coup attempt in Burkina Faso. Armed men tried to storm a military base outside Ouagadougou. They were stopped, but not by elite troops, by ordinary civilians. Videos flooded the internet. Women banging pots in the streets, shouting, "You will not take our future." Farmers formed human shields around the presidential palace. Even schoolteachers stood guard, chanting Traoré's name. It was not just loyalty, it was love. When Traoré appeared on national TV that evening, his voice trembled, not with fear, but with emotion. "Brothers and sisters, they came for me, but they met you. This is no longer about one man. This is about one people. They cannot defeat a nation that refuses to kneel." That night, Africa didn't sleep. In Accra, Dakar, Kinshasa, people lit candles in solidarity. The phrase "Africa will rise" trended for 72 hours straight. And in European capitals, the panic turned to disbelief, because even their own analysts admitted Traoré's movement has become a virus, one that no system can contain. But instead of celebrating, Traoré doubled down on his mission. He called an emergency session of the Sahel Alliance and proposed something unprecedented: a joint African defense command, not under NATO, not under France, but under Africa itself. "If we guard our borders together," he said, "no one can divide us ever again." The plan shocked the world. Western media mocked it, but across Africa, it was hailed as genius. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad pledged troops. Engineers from Ghana and Sudan offered support, and in a historic moment broadcast live, the alliance signed what would later be called the Pact of African Sovereignty. It was more than an agreement. It was a declaration of independence for an entire continent. And as Traore stood on that stage, under the blazing Sahel sun, he raised his hand and said, "We have waited long enough to be respected. Now we will make them respect us." The crowd roared, drums thundered, flags waved. Across the world, millions watched, in awe, in anger, in disbelief, because something extraordinary had just happened. A country once dismissed as poor and powerless had just redrawn the future of Africa. Burkina Faso's new movement was no longer a rebellion. It was a blueprint. From schools to government offices, from farms to battlefields, a single principle guided everything. Africa for Africans. Even nations outside the Sahel began knocking on the door. Congo, Eritrea, and even Tanzania expressed interest in joining the pact. It was no longer about one country's independence. It was about continental rebirth. And at the center of it all stood one man, not as a ruler but as a symbol of courage. Ibrahim Traoré. But symbols are dangerous. They inspire hope and threaten power. And so, the whispers began again. Anonymous reports hinted at international intervention. Rumors of mercenaries crossing borders. Sanctions lists prepared in secret. The West had failed to control the narrative, so now they would try to crush it. But this time, Africa was ready. Traoré addressed his nation one last time before the confrontation everyone feared. He stood before a sea of thousands, the wind carrying his words across the Sahel. "Brothers and sisters, the chains they used to bind us are broken, but freedom is not a gift. It is a war that never ends. If they come for our land, we fight. If they come for our gold, we defend. If they come for our spirit, we rise again, because Africa will never bow again." The people screamed, drums thundered, and somewhere across the Atlantic, the world finally understood. This was not a phase. This was history being rewritten. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, one truth remained unshaken. The day Traoré said no, Africa remembered who it truly was. A continent of kings, queens, warriors, and dreamers, no longer waiting for permission, just walking boldly into destiny. If you believe Africa's rise is unstoppable, if you believe the fire of freedom can never die, then make sure to subscribe for more stories the world tries to silence. Because this isn't just news, it's history unfolding right before our eyes. Subscribe now and never miss the revolution.